Hello and welcome to this Wednesday night activity here at West End United Methodist Church. You are joining us for Centering Your Week, and I am here with Susan Adcock. I was just asking Susan about her title. So the way that I introduce Susan to people is that she is the West Side Outreach Worker for Open Table Nashville. And she just said, nope, that's not quite my title. It's Street Outreach Coordinator and Resource Navigator, and that's it?
That's it without the coordinator part.
Oh, sorry, no coordinator. But if you could make your title fit what you actually do, what would your title be?
I'm not sure it could fit without it being just a lot of words, but I usually say Street Outreach and Housing Navigator because that sort of encompasses the two parts of it.
So are you reaching out to streets?
I'm reaching out to people who are out on the street, yes.
Yeah. And you work with Open Table Nashville, which is a partner of West End and has been a proud partner for a long time. And we're grateful for the work that you do and grateful for who you are. One of the things that we realized a little while back was that people had not really gotten the chance to get to know you based off of, except for when we say, we have this woman named Susan that we work with, and she's awesome. But we really wanted to use this opportunity tonight during our midweek centering time just to get to know you a little bit better, have you share some of who you are and what your stories are, and for folks to get to know the work that you do a little bit better so that they'll be able to understand why it is that this partnership is so valuable and it's such an important part of who we are, especially as it pertains to our faith and what we feel God calling us to do here at West End. So first things first, where are you from and what brought you to Nashville?
I grew up in Cincinnati, went to school at the University of Cincinnati, came to Nashville for a boy. Got married and thought I wanted to go to Vanderbilt at one point, get a graduate degree, and got wildly distracted by photography. And my job that I had in mental health sent me to Washington, and when I got on the plane to come back, I was a photographer. I dropped out of graduate school. I wasn't in graduate school at Vanderbilt, but I was at MTSU at that time. And so I dropped out and became a photographer for about 27 years.
So when did you first come to Nashville? What year?
1986.
Nashville's a little different now than it was in 1986.
It is very different. Yes,
it's different. And you've got to see it from behind a camera lens, but also just living your life here in Nashville. This wasn't on the list, but what big changes have you seen in Nashville since 1986?
Wow. The influx of people, for one thing.
Hi, sorry.
and the buildings that have just gone up. I just told somebody today, at one point I felt like as a photographer I'd been in every building in Nashville, but I certainly can't say that now.
Yeah, just so many new buildings.
Oh, yeah. And so sometimes now, of course, I pull up in an intersection and I think, where am I? Nothing is the same as it used to be. So it's been interesting to watch it grow up because it was a sort of a smaller, medium-sized town. I really loved it, especially as a freelance photographer. I got sent everywhere in town. And now just getting around town is
it's a chore. There's a lot more cars on the road and a lot more construction blocking the few lanes there are for cars on the road.
Yes. I've also seen the population of people who are unhoused grow exponentially. I remember I lived in South Nashville for a while, and I really remember the first time I saw folks on the corners, and they hadn't been there before. And
so that's been new since 1986.
That was after the flood.
Wow.
The 2010 flood.
And that 2010 flood, I don't want to jump because we're going to get there. That's kind of what started Open Table and its work.
It is.
Was this all of the sudden more awareness or acknowledgement that it had a really huge impact on people?
It did. I think one of the major incidences was that the folks in Tent City down on the river lost all of their belongings into the river, and the folks were they had nothing and no place to go and no plan and no resources, and so the folks that started Open Table jumped in and helped them navigate their situation. And then sort of people became aware, like you said, of the fact that people were living outdoors and the conditions that they were living under. And I think the city got behind it a little bit, and there were some other organizations that jumped in. And I'm not sure what housing was like prior to that for folks, sort of the history of it. But for a while there was a lot of housing available. And then there wasn't. You know, it was sort of, the housing that was available got filled up, and there was no new housing. There was shiny buildings, and, you know, the boom came.
And that was around 2010.
Yeah.
And so for people like me, if a flood comes, I probably have flood insurance. I was a renter. I probably had renter's insurance. I had income, so I would just hopefully recover what I needed to recover from renter's insurance for my belongings, and hopefully find a place close to my work to be able to rent again. But I think one of the things that Open Table discovered was that it just wasn't as easy. It was disproportionately harder for people who literally lost everything, including their house, including the tent that they were living in, and all of their possessions, their important IDs and birth certificates. And we'll get into that and just how important that is in a minute. But I want to back up. So you talked about being a photographer, and that was your profession. Do you consider that part of your profession still today? Is it a hobby? What else do you do besides photography?
It is definitely still part of my profession. A lot of the jobs that I had prior to doing this work sort of fell by the wayside, and there were a lot of new photographers in town also to take over those jobs. But I still have a little list of clients that call me for different events and fundraisers and portraits and headshots and things.
I was going to ask, what type of photography do you enjoy doing? You said you'd been in all the buildings.
Well, I really enjoy doing documentary photography. That was sort of the goal when I started. But the bread and butter was within events, special events and things like that. So that's what took me to all the different locations.
And you got to see a lot of Nashville.
I did. Yes.
And with special events, you're probably mostly seeing the moneyed side of Nashville.
I am. It is very different. Even when I would sort of, before I did this work, I would do this documentary projects behind the scenes of that, and then I would like change clothes and leave the bus station and go to a black tie party. And so it was like
stark contrast.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And the events were fun and beautiful and great to have paid work, and you still had this other part of what you were doing that you were feeling drawn to and feeling kind of a tug and a calling towards. So how did you get into this work? So tell me about that transition from, okay, I'm a photographer that's doing these events and this documentary work, and now I'm invested in making sure that Nashville's more equitable and that people have somebody that's on their side and walking with them.
I met a lot of people along the way who didn't really have a place to be. So I'd be out shooting for the scene or somebody, and I would just run into people I'd have conversations with, and that's how I learned that there were some people who were had opened some single resident occupancy housing, and I met a few people who lived there at Mercury Courts, and they didn't have anybody to sort of help them beyond getting them in that apartment. And so I'd give them my number for whatever reason. I'd take pictures of them and get to know them a little bit, and they'd call me up one day and say, hey, I really need somebody to take me to the Social Security office. Could you maybe give me a ride? And I was like, yeah, sure. Yeah, I had a lot of free time, and I just sort of got to know people by doing those little things, those little helpful things. And there was a guy named Barney who I got to be friends with, and he had lots of friends who were both on the street and newly housed. And so I got to know this group of folks that, with varying degrees of issues and non-issues. And so started doing sort of a project behind the scenes. I did a story for the scene at one point, the Nashville scene, about them, that group of folks. And
At Mercury Court.
yeah. And so they, like I said, had a lot of different sorts of individual problems and issues. And so that sort of, I learned so much from them.
Yeah.
And more than I could have ever really learned in a school or anything like that. And so that just always was in the background of whatever else I was doing to make money. Were these folks out in the world who just didn't have the same sort of resources that.
But who were people who were funny, who had their own
Lovable.
passions and hobbies, and who cared about each other and cared about you. And
Sure. And they were like family in a way.
yeah.
And so I ended up basically seeing them through the rest of their life. Most of them, they're still there were about 6 guys. There's still one guy left who's in a skilled nursing facility that I still see. But that's been, 25 years ago.
It's this theme that I hear when I talk to you of continued relationships built over time, built on trust, and your willingness to just say yes. Like, I need to go somewhere. Great, I'm free. I've got free time. Hop in the car. And continued showing up, which I think is one of the most important things you do. You go and you show up. When you say you're going to be there, you are known. They know you. You're not afraid for them to know your name. They are not a they. They are we. They are part of your family. They are part of a connected community. And I love that about your work, but also about Open Table. Open Table really stresses not treating folks as a problem to be fixed. Lindsay Crink starts most of her presentations with, people are not problems to be fixed. These are people with, unique interests and hobbies, and they are people to build relationships with and journey alongside. And I've always appreciated that about you. So knowing that most days are not typical for you, and that there probably isn't a typical day, if you were to have a typical day, what would that look like? What would you do?
My phone starts ringing usually about 7 in the morning. People call me with different things that they might need, or things that have happened overnight. Maybe somebody got robbed and things are very chaotic at that moment. And so I will make a list on my phone, and I probably have a little list from the day before, things that people need. And I try to figure out, can I orchestrate that before as I'm leaving the house? Or do I have those things that I can take them? And I kind of organize my day. If I don't have anything planned, I'll organize my day around those drop-offs. Sometimes it happens, and sometimes other things
Yes.
happen.
I'm familiar with this a lot with you.
Yeah.
I'll call you and you'll say, I can't do that. This emergency just happened.
It's very organic
Yes.
and really important to be flexible and willing to just sort of say, okay, this goes here and we're going to do this now.
Yep.
People, I have certain stops that I make most every day, or certainly throughout the week. 2 or 3 times a week I'll stop and see a specific group of people that I'm working closely with. And then there are other people who will call and say, hey, can you help me with housing, or can you help me do this, or I need an ID. And I will try to work those folks in. They're also a population of people who I've housed who don't have anybody, really. And so they'll call me for things, too, if they get confusing mail from the housing authority that they don't understand or something. They'll call and maybe read it to me on the phone, or maybe they don't read so well, and I'll go help them figure out if they need to do anything, or if it's just junk mail from somebody. But it always looks very official. So
That's how they get you.
yeah. Yeah. So there are things that happen all the time. People get sent to the hospital, and the hospital will call me. Life Alert has me on speed dial, I think, for a couple of folks. And people get arrested, and they'll call me. I have on my phone, when someone from the jail calls, it pops up and it says, help, I'm in jail. So
Hey, now you know.
I know that if that's what pops up, that somebody's in jail and needs help. So it's, like I said, very organic and unpredictable, and sometimes it's long days.
Yeah.
I worked 4 10-hour days,
Yes.
and very occasionally, I wasn't good at it at first. Usually I would be working on that 5th day too, but I've managed to kind of smooth it out and not if I can.
You have developed recently a better rhythm of work and rest
Mm-hmm.
that I think all of us could learn from. So thank you for helping, for doing that in your own life and helping, because this work is hard, right?
It is, yeah.
It is. There are good days, and I want to talk about that for a second. Sometimes you call and say, I can't come because this guy got housing. And those are great days.
That's the best day.
Because for those of you who aren't aware, housing is really difficult to come by in Nashville. We are full. We've got so many people coming in, and it's just not really beneficial for people to build affordable units right now in Nashville. There's very little incentive if you're a developer to develop affordable units right now, and so we have a hard time getting folks into housing. But on those days when it happens, it's like the best day ever.
Yeah.
Tell me about what that's like for you and the process to get somebody to that place.
It's a really complicated process, and it takes between 6 months and a year and a half, sometimes longer. But that's sort of an average. It consists, and we're sort of at the mercy of the housing authority and whether or not they open up the waiting lists on a really random
Yes.
schedule. And we get about, 3 days notice, I guess, that they're going to open it up at a certain time on a certain day. And so if I had a plan that day, it has to be trashed so that I can add all my folks onto that waiting list that are eligible. And so I will sit there and put their names on the list, and then we wait until they call us. And sometimes it's 6 weeks, and sometimes it's a year.
Wow.
And I have no way of predicting. Usually now, since I try to be there right when it opens, I know my names are at the top of the list. But now that there are very many more people who are doing housing, they're doing the same thing. So it's a race to see who can get their folks on faster. So it's sort of
Stressful.
inadvertently a competition.
Yes.
And so if you're an average person out in the world who doesn't have me or somebody else doing that for you, and you work, let's say, and you get home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and they've opened it at noon, you might be number 700 on that list.
And they have 20 units.
Yes.
So you may not be able to
And you
get
won't
in.
hear from them until the next sign up, and where they'll wipe your name off and you do it over again.
But some days
Some days.
you
Yes,
do get
I do get the
somebody
call.
into housing, and it is a beautiful day.
Yeah.
And some of my favorite posts on Open Table Nashville is when they post, of course, with permission of the person moving in, these pictures of them just, grinning from ear to ear because they are finally able to get housing. And housing means so very much. Mental stability, physical health. There's a whole list of things that housing does for you that really very little in the world does for you. And without housing, you are so vulnerable to so many things. If you are just joining us, this is Susan Adcock, who works with Open Table. I'm Pastor Stacey. Pastor Brandon is out this week, but I'm delighted to be here with Susan. We will be able to take your questions or comments on Facebook and on live stream. Know that it is just me monitoring both of those. So at some point this evening, I'm going to turn to those and see if anybody's got any questions for Susan. But I've got a big, long list here, so I want to keep going.
Okay.
Susan, what breaks your heart in the work that you do?
There are a couple of things. It breaks my heart that the general public is unaware of the stories behind how folks end up without housing.
Yeah.
And there's sort of a culture out there of that's a very narrow kind of window where people think they have that down. They're very committed in their response to folks who are experiencing homelessness. and it's a negative, it's sort of it's always a negative kind of thing. And that breaks my heart, because I feel like if everybody in the world knew what the backstory was, they would never allow it to happen, because it is so profoundly hard on people to be living outdoors. The other thing that breaks, and also the stories themselves of the way people are not only raised but become homeless. It's all trauma related, almost exclusively, and those stories are really difficult stories.
Yes.
And the other thing that breaks my heart is when people pass away before I can get them a house. We work on, in that year and a half, it's so, people are so vulnerable that a lot of my job is really just keeping people alive until I can get them to that place. And I don't know what the percentage is, but it's big that people will pass away on the street before I can get them in, especially since there are no places.
Yeah. That's what makes the donations that come into Open Table so important. So some people have said to me, why are we investing in things like tents and sleeping bags and propane tanks and heaters and all that? And the point is that it's so hard to get housing that so much of what you're trying to do is to stabilize people or provide them what they need to live outside. What are some of those things that you think people don't know about that are like, this is really important for living outside?
How sleep deprived people are.
Yes.
That alone, that one thing leads to so many medical issues: high blood pressure, heart disease, just general grouchiness.
Yes.
It's very hard to get any kind of regular sleep outdoors, and nutrition. People usually end up living on fast food when they live outdoors, and so just to have a regular sort of home cooked meal is such a gift. And physically, it's a dangerous, it's a dangerous place to be for anybody who's sleeping outdoors. Anything can happen, and they're afraid to go to sleep sometimes. What was the question?
What are some of the things that might surprise people that are kind of necessary for outdoor living that you wish more people would donate and would get to you?
As the seasons change and get more extreme, sleeping bags are so critical. Jeans are really something that people ask for a lot that we don't always have. And I think that's just because people don't donate their jeans. They wear them until they wear out. Same with belts.
Yes.
There's extreme lack of belts because people just wear them. Tents and propane are critical also. There's so many more people now in their cars.
Yes.
And a lot of times when you're living in your car, it goes okay and you can do it until the car breaks down. And then maybe you don't have enough money to have the car fixed, and then it gets towed. And so you're forced eventually to go in a tent or someplace, if you're in town, in the city, and just find a place to sleep. And so I had a gentleman last winter who was sleeping in his car, but he couldn't lie down prone. He needed to lie down prone because of his medical situation, and he couldn't. And he got frostbite and lost both of his feet. Or he lost the foot sort of below the knee, and then the toes on his other foot, or half of his other foot. And he was a perfectly healthy, other than this situation with legs, hardworking, blue-collar kind of guy who, had a relatively normal life. And he was even in a car. And if he'd been lying down in the back seat, it wouldn't have happened. But so those are the sorts of things that he didn't even anticipate that was going to happen. And it happens a lot. That in sort of, let's see, what else would be really a critical thing? just things to keep warm and cool in the summer.
Yeah.
I think lots of times in the summer the heat gets so bad that it creeps up on people and they don't realize that it's happening until it's too late, or something, heat stroke type things happened.
We had a couple of really hot days this summer, and it was part of what prompted us to open up our quiet space downstairs, was because we recognized the need to have, okay, so we've got air conditioning. We're paying for it anyway. Might as well have a space for people to sit down and enjoy the air conditioning.
Exactly.
And to be able to have access to water, which is so crucial. Dehydration is such a problem.
And lots of times when if you walk in the emergency room at the hospital, especially if you've been there a lot, being overheated or dehydrated will be mistaken for intoxication. And that's happened.
And then they don't get the treatment that they should get.
Right. They get sent out multiple times until it's too late and you have brain damage from it. And so I understand how that happens, but at the same time, it's so simple to fix it. Just cases of water.
Yep.
And
IV hydration.
sure.
And it makes them feel better.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things that break your heart. But I know that you wouldn't be doing this work unless there were pieces of it that make your heart sing, and relationships that have been so important for you. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the beautiful side of the work that you do and the people you've met.
That's sort of the thing that keeps me going, are the people that I've met and that I work with, because they are just precious human beings. And because I get to know so much about them, it makes it so that them so easily lovable. I love to find out sort of what they are beyond this immediate situation. I have some folks that know a lot about music and the arts, and one guy who was a sound guy at one point for rock and roll bands. And so they have this whole well-developed history. And I love to find out about that from folks. And I love, like you said before, getting them into housing. That's sort of the best day. There's it's interesting. I don't know if you are going to talk about it or not, but I love the first day we go to get people's birth certificates too. That's sort of a secret thing that I like, because when they look at that birth certificate, something is triggered about their childhood that makes it sort of a sweet memory. And so I enjoy that activity of the birth certificate. And then the move-in day, even though I know, and I tell them, we have a little powwow before they move into their apartment, and where I tell them that this is not going to solve all of your problems, but it's going to give you a safe place to do that.
Yeah.
And it's your place, it's your personal space, and you can do whatever you want to with it. And just being with somebody on that day is a gift and a privilege.
I remember going with somebody to get an ID one time, and just this little, and it was a temporary ID before they got sent, the real ID in the mail. And it wasn't their driver's license, it was just a state ID. But for them, for the state to know their name, to know their birth date, to have a picture, and to have an ID that they could show when they needed to get things done, it was a huge day. And it's something that I take for granted, right? Like, I've had an ID since I was born. My dad was in the military. I've had a passport since I was, all of these things, once again, that I think a lot of folks don't think about, that make life easier for us, is so much harder when you don't have it. And the $16, I don't know what it cost here, but the $16 that it takes to get that ID, for me, is nothing. But for some folks who absolutely need it, it's money that is not accessible, or it's the difference between eating a meal and getting an ID, or having part of the money that they need for a hotel room that night, or getting an ID. And the hotel and your basic needs are always going to go above and beyond what you would like to have for an ID. So those are good days.
Yeah, I helped a guy get his name changed once, and he had been struggling with it since he was like 17 years old. His mom changed his name when he was in jail.
Okay.
For a variety of reasons, and she didn't ask him, and it wasn't even his real last name. And so he'd been struggling with this since then, because it didn't match his driver's license or his ID. And there was always this struggle to get documents that matched because his name had been changed. And when we got it changed, he was so proud to be who he was born to be.
And to be known by a name, to be recognized,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And for so many folks, I think that I've come across, they've said to me, you know, people don't even act like I'm here. Or if they do, I'm a nuisance to them. So to have somebody like you to say their name, to have a piece of paper that indicates that they are somebody. We already know that they're somebody. And of course they're somebody to God who created them and loves them. But they now have this very important piece of documentation. That's beautiful. What do you wish more people knew about the work that you do?
I wish that they knew how difficult housing is. I wish that they knew how normal and ordinary the folks who are out on the street are. I mean, that's another question I think that you have on there is about the folks that I work with.
You can answer that question too.
As far as the work that I do, I think it's how really truly difficult it is, and not for me. It doesn't matter that it's difficult for me, but the fact that people are suffering so much out there, and how overwhelming it can be, because you know there are lots and lots of people out there who want my help, but I can't cover. You know, I can't clone myself. If I could, there'd be a lot of.
I would love to have a Susan Adcock.
I would love to be able to help everybody, but the fact that I have to sort of do triage and only help a certain number of people is difficult, because I want to help everybody as much as I can, and I wish it was easier to help.
Yes.
By more housing. The housing situation in Nashville, I try sometimes to encourage people to think about maybe moving to a different, smaller satellite town. Yeah, Murfreesboro, Clarksville, smaller towns. It's a little easier sometimes, but most of the time they're kind of dug in, and they know where things are in Nashville, and they don't want to start over. So
and they have their community.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I get it.
They know. I do too. And at the same time, I've also said, have you tried living somewhere else where the basic? I mean, right now, I think the average price for a one-bedroom unit is $1,500. $1,500. That's more than I pay in mortgage.
Yeah.
For my house.
Yeah.
And I can afford to live a little farther out because I have a car and can get in. And so folks that typically don't have a car need to live on a bus line and need to live close to services and close to the hospital or close to their doctors or their place of employment. And it's expensive. And it's really expensive to be homeless.
It's so much. And it's hard to, when I house people, they don't have a lot of choices. You know, the person that calls from the wait list, that's where they end up living. So they sort of are forced into this place. Not that they have to accept it, but they often do, because it's better than sleeping outdoors. So they'll say, all right, I'll take that spot, but maybe they're not familiar with that neighborhood. Maybe they work on the other side of town, or their friends are on the other side of town, and it sort of isolates them in a way that they haven't been isolated before, and I hate that that happens.
Yeah, community is important, and I think one of the other pieces of things that I don't think people understand about people who live outside is that they often do have community, even if it's just the guy that sleeps on the bench right next to them, or family that's in town that they regularly visit, and some of them do have good relationships with family, even if some of them are strained. That web and network of relationships exists in ways that may not look familiar to some of us, but is important.
Sure, and sometimes that's all they have.
Yes.
And that, to take that away, or, you know, make it harder to get that is a struggle.
And so you have to understand why some people turn places down, right? Like, you have to get it, and it's hard. It's so hard, especially for me. I'm like, but Susan, you've been on this list for a year and a half. Susan got you on this list. But you have to understand that for those folks, community is so important, and they don't want to leave that community, even if it means getting a house. So I'm going to ask this next question, but before I do, it is 6:52, and I want to make sure people know that they can ask us questions either by live stream or in the chat. We do have a live studio audience, so you all are welcome to also ask questions in a minute. But let me ask this question first, so be thinking if you guys got any questions for Susan. The question I have is, if you could wave a magic wand and fix Nashville for the better, what changes would you make?
I would add a lot of housing.
Housing everywhere.
Housing everywhere, all in every neighborhood. I would also take all of those waiting lists and turn them into one list. I would start at the top of the list, and I would say, where would you like to live? Choices. And also, I would add some housing that's not traditionally thought of as public housing or low-income housing. Like, for example, one of the very first guys that I got into, I was working with, he wanted to live out in the country. He was from the country, and he wanted to live out in the country, maybe on a farm or on a piece of property where he could have a mobile home or something like that. And the options that I had available were nowhere near that. I mean,
Apartments in the city.
Yeah, and so he ended up finding, through a distant relative, some property that he could rent. But for folks that have, different views and different opinions about where they'd like to live, I wish they had those choices.
And more variety in housing options. Right now, most of the time, you're going to get an apartment.
Yeah.
Maybe a townhouse, maybe. But not likely.
One in 5 years I've housed in a duplex. And
very few, if any, single-family homes.
Right.
That aren't specifically MDHA single-family homes. And, a lot of people would like to have a yard.
Yeah.
And would like to live in a place that would allow them to have a pet.
Yeah.
And that's not always something you can get.
I had another guy that had 2 big dogs and was kind of like an old, crusty biker type of guy. And he couldn't find a place. I couldn't find him a place. I went to biker bars looking for people with property that might rent to him. And I just, beat the streets looking for a place. He had a Section 8 voucher, but it expired because you only get 60 days.
To find housing once you get approved.
Once you get approved, you've got 60 days to lease up. And all of those places that offer vouchers or that will take a voucher, they've got waiting lists a mile long. And so that's another really difficult situation. In Nashville, we have more availability recently with vouchers since some money's been coming in recently, but there's also an influx of people that they're housing and no housing.
It's so hard.
So yeah, the 2 dogs didn't get housed either. Later on, he bought himself a motorhome, and
I love that.
Yeah.
That's why we also partner with another organization, Posture Nashville. Want to shout out to them. That takes care of animals for people that are in transition, trying to figure out different places. So
yeah, that's so helpful.
That is, because animal companions are so important. And
it is.
And super important to me and to folks that are living outside as well. Now, throughout, you've kind of talked about what you wish we knew about people experiencing homelessness, and you've told us some stories, like about the guy with the dogs. But I wonder specifically if there's any stories that you'd like to share with us, obviously without names, or maybe you have permission to share those stories and would like to share those stories with us.
Well, let's see. On
she
your
has many.
I do. There are, on your list it said stories of people that we have in common. I couldn't think of anybody that we have in common, but there are lots of stories. Let's see.
While you're thinking,
okay, yeah.
I'm going to ask if anybody has a question from the audience, or if anybody has a question online. Okay. I'm going to go bring them the mic.
Okay.
And then I will let you think of the answer to that question as well.
The stories, they're all on TikTok.
Since I've done a lot of hiking, including winter camping, I know how important wool socks are. Can we donate wool socks to you?
Absolutely. Sure.
That's a great question. That's one of my
and, you know,
favorite
and
questions.
even if the colors don't match, it seems to me, you know, if you're homeless, a black and a blue, one black and one blue sock would still be warm.
Yeah, it's true. Always helpful, anything that keeps people
Yeah.
feet dry and warm. A lot of folks spend a winter with wet feet, and or maybe not the entire winter, but a lot longer than they should.
And shoes?
Shoes are good too.
Okay.
And it's really important that we get athletic shoes or work boots, not dress shoes. We get tons of dress shoes. I don't know about y'all at Open Table.
Yeah, we've had people try to give us dress shoes, but we usually take those to Thrift Smart, and they let us weigh. If we get donations that we don't use, we just weigh it, and then eventually they'll give us some gift cards.
That's
So
great.
folks can go shop and buy their own stuff, which is helpful.
Can we donate to Thrift Smart in y'all's name and have that happen too?
I think so.
That would be
Absolutely.
excellent.
Yeah,
Okay.
they have a book in the front.
Excellent.
And you can just weigh the stuff yourself and write it in the book.
Okay, folks, you heard it here, because I have several of you saying, but where do I donate my dress clothes or my women's clothes? You've heard it here. Go to Thrift Smart, and you can give it in the name of Open Table, and they'll get gift cards for it, so it will help some of the folks that we have in common and have in our community that you've assisted before. Did you have another question,
Well, I
Diana?
have a comment
Yeah.
from a medical perspective, and also from the perspective of someone who has issues with dehydration, and that is, in addition to water in the heat, you need salt.
Yes.
So,
Gatorade.
salty things
Yep.
Uh-huh.
as well.
Thank you for that. Matthew,
Sure.
did you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if how you would help people who with disabilities that are on the streets.
It
You
can,
know, I'm legally blind. It'd be really bad for me to be out in the street. Oh, I have family, but a lot of people where I live now have no family, and if they do something like sell the building, which I've heard rumors about for the last 10 years, that could be very bad.
Yep.
it is, and there are lots.
Disabled with no family, and you have no idea, you don't know anybody here really. That could be bad. Or moving me all the way out to Antioch, that's not going to happen. I'll probably end up in Clarksville with my little sister,
Yeah.
which means no more coming here.
So talk to us about that. What's the specific thing that you can do in that situation?
We have, I run into lots of folks with disabilities, and it's a challenge because there aren't any, aside from, say, being a veteran, there aren't a lot of options that are specific to people with disabilities. There's some properties now that only accept folks that have disabilities, and that they will open up those wait lists a little more often. But specific to helping that person in the moment, there just aren't that many choices. I have right now lots of amputees, people that were diabetics, people with traumatic brain injuries, and the hospitals will try to send them to skilled nursing, and if they for any reason misbehave, or if their insurance cuts them off after 2 weeks, they will literally open the door and send them back out. Recently I had a double amputee who escaped from skilled nursing on purpose. I mean, literally he somehow, I don't know how he did it, but he was at a doctor's appointment outside the skilled nursing, and instead of getting on the Access Ride bus, he went a different direction. He just did not, because, again, trauma.
Yeah.
People feel like, people feel like they're being controlled, or lots of times it happens with folks that have been in jail for a long time. They just feel like the walls are caving in on them. And so if they're being told what to do and how to do it and when to do it, then sometimes they just say, no, I can't do this. And that's another reason why a lot of folks will be resistant to the Mission and or Rimini Inn or other places that are shelter-based. And it's not that they want to be homeless. That's another thing that really, I get a lot of that question, and it's hard because nobody wants to be homeless. Even though they might appear in
Even
that.
though they've made a choice,
Yeah, it's usually what's better
Yep.
or worse
lack of options.
choice. Yeah. Same with in the beginning when they become unhoused. Sometimes it's to get away from a worse nightmare,
Yes.
or they didn't have any choice. So I find a lot of domestic violence, folks that have been in that situation. It's if you feel like sleeping outdoors is safer than sleeping in your own home, then that's a choice you've made as a responsible adult. And so people with disabilities, they suffer outdoors, and I think their lives are shortened dramatically by the fact that there aren't that many options.
We've had somebody online saying, thank you so much for this informative conversation. It is a couple of minutes after 7. So I'm going to ask if you will send me an email with the answer to a couple of questions we didn't get to, because I am
Sure.
super interested specifically in the advocacy piece, because part of what Open Table Nashville does is education. This is why we've had Lindsay Crinks here a couple of times doing some trainings for us. Part of it is the work that you do, which is outreach and resource navigation. And then part of it, that's a really important piece of this, is this advocacy piece. So we walk alongside people, we educate ourselves, and then we promote better public policy to help folks and help us be better people in a better Nashville together. And I think that's a really important piece. So I will share that answer with you all in a different format at a later time. So look for that. And I also would love to hear any stories in that email as well. I do want to set us up for the next couple of weeks. Next Wednesday, we have Sally Honor with us. And we're excited for that conversation. Sally is part of our Tizay community, as well as being part of our community here at West End. She teaches the Alexander technique. She's fascinating, wonderful. Can't wait for her to join us next Wednesday. And then the week after that, we're going to continue a conversation with members from Open Table Nashville with Lindsay Crinks. Lindsay's written a fantastic book called Praying with Our Feet. I'm going to go ahead and encourage you now, if you've not gotten that book, go ahead and get that book and read it. It's not a requirement to join the conversation at the end of the month, but I do think that it's just a great book that you should read anyway. So pick up that book by Lindsay Crinks, Praying with Our Feet. It talks about the founding of Open Table Nashville and the important work that she does, and tells some stories of her own journey that she's gone through to get to where she is today. Susan, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I love our time with you. I always love talking to you. Now everybody else got to hear our chats. Susan comes here to West End on a lot of Thursdays, so you can see her downstairs. The purpose of her being here is not to chat with you all, but to chat with folks that she needs to meet with, because while she does go out, people are mobile. And so it's nice for her to have office hours at a space that people can come to. We're on the bus line, so it's great for her to have a little office hours downstairs. And so she's been part of kind of our quiet space. And part of the reason why we've created Quiet Space, once again, is to have a safe place for folks to come in. If that work is something that intrigues you, if it's something that you are interested in doing, I'd love to talk to you about that. But Open Table has a lot of outreach opportunities for volunteers, specifically with winter coming up. A lot of winter trainings that are coming up about how to go out to folks, let them know what's available, see what their needs are. At some point this winter, there'll be a call for folks to take people to shelters when the temperature drops below a certain point. And I know that Open Table would love to have you be part of that volunteer crew. We'll get you more information on that as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Susan, for joining us.
Thank you.
Have a great night.